Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into, well, one of the really big, heavy subjects in 20th century history, the rise of Stalinism and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this deep dive, it's designed to tackle a fundamental question, one posed right there in the sources you shared. Did the USSR fail because, socialism fundamentally cannot work?
That really is the core mission today. Yeah.
Yeah.
The sources we're looking at, they're a collection of articles, some book excerpts, and they often come from the perspective of what's called the anti-Stalinist left opposition.
Mm.
So there's a heavy focus on Leon Trotsky's work, and they offer a very specific, and you have to say highly ideological way of answering that big question.
And their answer seems to be a pretty clear no, right? The sources argue that what came about under Stalin, it wasn't the inevitable outcome of the 1917 revolution, not at all. They see it as a profound political failure, a degeneration.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they use this term, a caricature of genuine socialism. Now, to understand what they mean by that, we first have to look at how they define the real thing, the genuine article. For the authors of this material, genuine socialism, it needs things like workers' democracy, freedom of expression, and crucially, internationalism. The idea that the revolution has to spread globally to survive.
Okay. So when they say caricature, they mean it was missing those key parts, like the democracy, the international aspects.
Exactly, those foundational elements.
Right.
So our job here is to explore the specific historical context and the internal political fights they claim led to this political degeneration, as they call it.
Right. Let's start with the beginning then, the revolution itself. The sources do acknowledge upfront that the Soviet Union achieved quite a lot, didn't it? Significant economic development, social gains, especially when you consider the backward economy it started with. So if things started okay, what went wrong according to these texts?
Well, what went wrong, according to this material, it wasn't so much about, say, flawed Marxist theory. It was more about the harsh historical reality they faced. Marx, he kind of suggested that socialism should build on the most advanced bits of capitalism. You needed industrial plenty first, ideally.
But Russia wasn't like that.
No, the revolution happened in a country that was relatively agrarian, pretty backward industrially speaking.
Meaning they were already sort of behind the eight ball from the start,
Yeah,
materially speaking.
exactly. And the sources really hammer this point home. The revolution, they argue, could only have succeeded in the long run if it had become part of a much bigger worldwide change of society.
Yeah.
In other words, the Russian Revolution was meant to be the spark, not the whole bonfire itself.
But that global wave of revolution after 1917, it didn't fully materialize. The sources say it was held back and betrayed, first by social democratic leaders in places like Germany, then later the authors claim because of mistakes made by the new communist leaderships elsewhere.
Right, so the Soviet Union was left effectively stranded, isolated.
And that isolation factor is key then.
It's paramount in their analysis, because the Soviet Union was left, as they put it, isolated and with limited industrial development. The resulting poverty and constant pressure became the breeding ground for something new, a new social layer.
Okay, I want to dig into that mechanism a bit because it's one thing to say, okay, they were isolated, but how does that geographical isolation actually translate into political power being usurped by this privileged bureaucracy? What were the conditions that let this administrative class grab the reins?
Well, the sources connect scarcity directly to administration. I mean, think about it. In conditions of really extreme poverty, constant military threats, someone has to decide who gets what little there is. The sources argue this job fell to the state bureaucracy, and this group, the administrators, the party officials, they started to demand more resources, more privileges for themselves, basically just to do the job of managing the state.
Okay. So they became like a managerial caste who needed, say, better rations just so they could manage the rationing for everyone else, that kind of thing?
Right. Precisely. That's the dynamic they describe. Material deprivation leads to the rise of this managerial layer. And then, crucially, this layer consolidates its power by suppressing workers' democracy. Why? Because real democracy would have challenged their growing privileges.
I see.
So the regime that resulted, in their view, became a kind of political counter-revolution against the working class, leading to what the sources call that monstrous totalitarian regime.
So the failure for them was in the politics that grew out of the shortages, not the fundamental economics of the socialist idea itself.
That's the core of their argument, yes.
And importantly, the sources stress this wasn't inevitable. It didn't just happen. It was actively fought against right from the beginning. Which brings us to the internal struggle, led first by Lenin and then later by Trotsky.
Yes, and we see that struggle starting almost as soon as the bureaucracy began to flex its muscles. You mentioned Lenin's last struggle. What's fascinating is how the sources portray this period, the last couple of years of his politically active life. It's presented almost as this heroic, kind of lonely fight.
Yeah.
Lenin himself, they say, noticed and fought against the early symptoms of bureaucratic degeneration. You see it in his last letters, his articles.
So it wasn't just that he was sick, he was actively politically fighting Stalin in this trend, even as his health was failing. What specific things did he try to do?
Well, the sources highlight a couple of things. First, Lenin apparently fought quite hard to strengthen this body called the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, the Rabkrin, which was supposed to check the bureaucracy's power, before he eventually turned against its head, who was Stalin. Second, and maybe more famously, he reacted very strongly against the growing sort of crude nationalism he saw in Stalin and his allies, particularly regarding something called the Georgian affair, where Stalin dealt very heavy-handedly, quite rudely, with the local Bolsheviks in Georgia. Lenin saw this sort of bullying centralism, this crudeness, as fundamentally anti-revolutionary.
So his fight was quite specific then, against Stalin's power grab, against that centralizing tendency, and even against his personal style, his character.
Yes, and this internal struggle, this fight Lenin started, that then becomes the vital heritage, as the sources put it, for the anti-Stalinist left opposition, which Trotsky leads after Lenin's death.
So they weren't inventing a new fight, they were essentially trying to carry on Lenin's fight for the original principles.
That's how it's framed. They were fighting for the implementation of the revolutionary ideals and the democratic principles that they believed Lenin himself had warned were being trampled on.
Okay. And the sources talk a lot about the work of this left opposition, this intense struggle over, what, a decade, trying to combat that rising bureaucracy. But the price they paid was enormous. Not just politically, being exiled, purged internally, but actual violence, right down to Trotsky's own family.
Absolutely. And the accounts from Trotsky's grandson, Esteban Volkov, they really bring the terrifying physical reality of this struggle into sharp focus. The sources emphasize, look, the bureaucracy didn't just win arguments or votes. They systematically, physically eliminated the opposition.
It was a literal hunt.
Yes. The sources remind us Leon Trotsky himself was assassinated by a GPU agent, Stalin's secret police in Coyoacan, Mexico, August 20, 1940. His murder cut one of the last living links to the leadership of the original October Revolution. But the violence against him, it was relentless, even before that final blow.
And the sources detail that earlier attack, don't they? Just a few months before, May 24, 1940.
It was incredibly brutal. Volkov, who was only 14 at the time, describes being wounded in this machine gun attack on their house by Stalinist supporters. Miraculously, the family survived that attempt. But the point the sources make is clear. Look at the lengths the bureaucracy went to silence its main ideological opponent.
Yeah.
For them, this confirms the bureaucracy wasn't just a different political faction. It acted like murderous counter-revolutionaries.
So, okay, the internal fight was incredibly brutal. The bureaucracy won politically. What were the consequences of that victory for the Soviet state itself? If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources give us two really stark examples: military disaster and a huge step backwards socially.
Yes, the military catastrophe of World War II is often cited as the first and perhaps bloodiest consequence of this bureaucratic rule. The sources argue that Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion on June 22, 1941, became such a bloody catastrophe, partly because of the wrecking behavior of Stalin and the bureaucracy.
That's a huge claim. They're basically blaming the leadership for those devastating initial losses. What's the evidence they put forward for that?
Well, they point directly to the decapitation of the Red Army and the infamous purge trials of the late 1930s. The sources claim Stalin eliminated vast numbers of experienced officers, like 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, huge percentages of corps and division commanders, thousands of experienced military leaders gone, just before the biggest war in their history.
Wow.
So the argument is the military was effectively gutted of its experienced leadership. This, they say, directly contributed to the Nazis' rapid advance early on and cost the lives of nearly 5 million Soviet troops just in those initial phases.
Though the sources do maintain, don't they, that the Soviet people eventually turned things around through incredible heroism and sacrifice.
Oh, absolutely.
But the argument is this was despite their leaders, not because of them.
Exactly. The heroism of the ordinary soldiers, the workers, the peasants, that's fully acknowledged. But the authors emphasize that their lives were put at much greater risk because of the mismanagement and paranoia of the Stalinist elite.
Okay. And the second consequence you mentioned, The social regression. This involves the criminalization of homosexuality, something often overlooked.
Yeah, and this reversal, it perfectly illustrates the source's argument about a political counter-revolution playing out. Because in the early years of the Russian Revolution, homosexuality had actually been decriminalized.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reflected the broader revolutionary ideals of individual freedom, emancipation from the old czarist morality.
So the early revolutionary government was actually much more socially liberal on this front than the czarist regime it replaced. How did the bureaucracy justify rolling that back, putting the country into reverse?
Well, the sources argue that the bureaucracy needed to impose a kind of rigid, reactionary social morality. It helped ensure conformity, social control. That early revolutionary ideal of individual liberation, that was seen as potentially destabilizing, a political threat to the state's total authority. So in March 1934, Stalin recriminalized homosexuality right across the Soviet Union. Homosexual acts became punishable by 3 to 5 years in prison. The sources present this as a very clear political move to shore up a conservative social order that benefited the ruling bureaucratic class. And moving towards the end, the eventual collapse. The sources point to major events like the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9, 1989, as the beginning of the end for these Stalinist systems. The economic stagnation that ultimately brought them down, the sources argue, was basically the natural result, the decay, of a system choked by political totalitarianism.
And even after the collapse, the sources show there's this clear, ongoing effort, even today, to defend what they see as the original ideas of Lenin and Trotsky against, well, historical distortions. They're actively fighting these historical battles.
They absolutely are. They view history as a live battlefield, not just something in the past. You see examples of specific rebuttals being written, countering claims made in popular history books, like they mentioned responding to Orlando Figes or hitting back against media portrayals. They talk about countering a Netflix series called Trotsky, which was produced by Russian state TV.
Ah.
They describe it as a scandalous misrepresentation, basically a deliberate attempt to poison the image of this key revolutionary figure.
So the underlying intent of these authors, it seems, is framed as an appeal, like rediscover the truth about Trotsky, go back to the original undistorted ideas of the revolution. This historical deep dive isn't just academic for them, is it? It's necessary for politics today.
It's entirely practical for them, yes. It's really an appeal to activists, to readers today, to reconnect with what they see as the genuine revolutionary principles. Principles they believe were tragically hijacked by the Stalinist counter-revolution. The idea is if you understand that history correctly, you can build future movements on a sounder theoretical basis.
Okay, so wrapping this part up, we've traced the argument presented in these sources, that the Soviet failure wasn't really about socialism itself being flawed, but about the specific historical circumstances of isolation, which then led to a political counter-revolution by a privileged and, frankly, ruthless bureaucracy. And that resulted in the monstrous totalitarian regime they describe.
And this raises an important related point that the sources bring up, actually, when they discuss how the original Bolshevik Party itself was formed. They stress that the whole process of developing revolutionary activists, revolutionary cadres, it's incredibly complicated, how difficult, how full of contradictions. They remind us you only have to read the letters between Marx and Engels carefully or really study the history of the Bolshevik Party before 1917 to see that the path to political change is never simple. It's never guaranteed, never straightforward.
That's a really powerful point, a reminder that even these massive ideological movements are full of internal struggles, contingencies, human factors. So thinking about the sheer depth of that ideological fight described in these sources, I mean, a fight spanning decades, involving assassinations, it makes you wonder, what foundational assumptions do you, listening now, think are being questioned when history like this gets revisited and retold today? What existing historical narratives, maybe ones we accept almost without thinking, might actually be much simpler versions of a far more complicated, messy internal struggle over power and ideas? Something to definitely mull over until our next deep dive.